Within a thousandth of a second of the detonation of that bomb, a fireball forms that reaches out for 2 miles in every direction. Within that area, temperatures approach those on the surface of the sun, and everything is vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself just disappears. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the winds are greater than 600 miles per hour, and the blast pressure is 25 pounds per square inch. Mechanical forces of that nature destroy anything human beings can build.
I'm your host, Ryan Pelletier, and for today's episode of Circadian Rhythm, I had the absolute pleasure to sit down with Dr. Ira Helfand. Ira is a retired physician, an author, and a lecturer, mainly on the medical and humanitarian consequences of nuclear war. Ira has worked with a couple of different organizations, and his work in these groups has earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985 and a second Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. Join us as we envision a brighter tomorrow, free from the destructive forces of nuclear weapons. You and I have spoken previously about your work in these organizations, but I'd like to learn more, and that's kind of why I asked you to come here today, both about your story, but also about nuclear weapons in general, and how we can all get involved in this movement to basically denuclearize the world.
Yeah.
Am I putting it correctly? Did I misquote anything?
No, I think that's exactly right. Right at the moment, we are kind of on the brink of nuclear war.
Yeah.
And we're not acting that way. There's an incredibly dangerous situation that's evolved over the last decade or so, really escalating with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we all ought to be walking around thinking 24 hours a day, what can I do to keep the world from blowing up?
Yeah.
And we're all instead walking around going about our usual business as though nothing special is happening. And that's going to change, or else we're going to have some very bad things happen.
Do you think this, I've been reading about, threats Putin's made and moving, I think he moved some nuclear weapons into Belarus. Is that correct? Did you hear that?
Yeah. Since the invasion, there's just been a flood of explicit nuclear threats coming out of Russia, from Putin, from his former deputy Medvedev, from others in the Russian leadership. Really unprecedented. Well, I should say unprecedented in the quantity of threats. When the U.S. invaded Iraq, we were very clear also that nuclear weapons were on the table, that we would consider using them if we needed to. And we have made other nuclear threats over the decades. But this sort of constant stream of threatening rhetoric from Moscow is really quite extraordinary. And I think it has to be taken seriously. We don't know if Putin's going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but it would be a crazy thing for him to do. But the whole invasion has been crazy. Blowing up the dam a few weeks ago was crazy.
Yeah. And
I think there's a real danger either that he'll use them or that somehow or other the conflict will escalate and we'll stumble into the use of nuclear weapons without anybody actually planning to do it. Sort of like World War I kind of built on itself. No one really wanted that war to start, but once one side did one thing, it just led to other things happening.
Yeah, and I think it's like sort of like the shot heard around the world, right? Is we don't really necessarily know what side fired first, and then it escalates into this battle. So you don't think it's really just posturing by Putin? You think this is actually a realistic threat he's making? I mean, obviously, if their sovereignty was threatened, it would be on the table, and he may actually use this. But you think absent that, he might actually fire nuclear weapons into Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. I mean, we all hope that this is just posturing. And in a sense, that's using nuclear weapons, right? You know, if you tell the world, let me invade Ukraine or I'll blow up the world with nuclear weapons, you're using the weapons. You're not detonating them, but you're using them to enforce your will.
It's like being the biggest guy in the room kind of thing. It's the threat of it more than anything else.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think we have to understand that the threat of use of nuclear weapons itself is something that has to end. But it could go beyond that. Certainly if the Ukrainians make very significant progress this summer, in liberating large sections of their country, which Putin has now annexed formally to Russia, He could say, I've told you if you invade Russia, I will use nuclear weapons. And by my definition, you've invaded Russia, even though it's not the definition of anybody else in the world. I think it's possible. And I certainly hope it doesn't happen, but I think it is a real possibility. And again, just the possibility of this whole conflict spinning out of control. I don't know if you saw the reports just this week that during their march to Moscow a few weeks ago, the Wagner forces, a group of them broke off from the main group.
And they were marching to Moscow, right?
Well, the main force was marching to Moscow, but a group broke off and was marching towards Voronezh, where there is a military base in which Russian nuclear warheads are stored. And they were going there to get the nuclear warheads.
I did not hear that.
And they got to the base, according to Reuters this morning.
Wow.
They did not take any of the weapons.
Was that just reported this morning?
Last night and this morning, yeah.
Wow. No, I didn't hear that.
And it just underlines the incredible instability of the situation because, the mutiny is not, it appears to be over, but the situation there remains extremely unstable and unsettled because of what happened. Prigozhin's still in St. Petersburg. We're not sure what he's doing there. We don't know who else in the Russian military was sympathetic to Prigozhin or what they will do if things go bad on the battlefield in Ukraine, if there will be other mutinies like this. And the thought of significant political instability involving possibly rival military factions fighting it out in a country that has 6,000 nuclear warheads ought to scare the bejesus out of all of us. And we're not acting appropriately given the level of threat.
The thing with the Wagner forces was kind of interesting because that was essentially almost like a secret police of Russia, correct? Like a secret army almost that Putin had assembled under the guise of what a special force almost, but they were supposed to be like a private contractor, but really he had been controlling them all along, from what I understand anyways. And then they've almost gone rogue on him.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah, and I think this was quite surprising and disturbing to him. This
is a good friend of his too.
Right.
If sociopaths are capable of having friends.
So we have a situation where we have sociopaths in charge of huge nuclear arsenals, and we are not taking the necessary steps to try to get rid of those arsenals before something bad happens. A generation ago, maybe a little bit more, back in the 1980s, people got it. There were millions of people who understood how dangerous nuclear weapons were and how likely it was that we were going to have a nuclear war if we didn't do something about it. And
Reagan, during the Reagan
administration.
And you had met with Reagan, correct?
I didn't personally, but people from my organization did.
All right.
And, at that point, it was the policy in 1983 of the U.S. government to prepare to fight and win a nuclear war in Europe. This is a crazy idea, but it was U.S. policy. And millions of people said, this is nuts. They got into the streets. They were demanding change. And they got it. In 1983, we were going to fight and win a nuclear war in Europe. 1985, Reagan sat down with Gorbachev and said, nuclear war can never be won, which is correct.
Yep.
And must never be fought, which is correct. And it was a 180-degree change in U.S. nuclear policy. It was so complete a reversal from what he had been saying 2 years before that initially most of us didn't believe it was real. We thought this was just kind of campaign stuff.
Right.
But it turns out it was. And we had really changed U.S. nuclear policy. And Reagan and Gorbachev went on to secure a number of deals to cut down on the size of their arsenals, to end the Cold War nuclear arms race. And they talked about getting rid of all nuclear weapons at the Reykjavik summit, but they didn't reach that agreement, unfortunately. When the Cold War ended, everybody started acting as though the whole problem had gone away. And it was better. The U.S. and the Soviet Union weren't at each other's throats, but there was still thousands of nuclear warheads in the world just sitting around waiting for things to get bad again. And now they've gotten bad again.
I feel like I know your answer to this because you probably wouldn't be doing what you do if you didn't fundamentally believe it. Do you think it is actually possible for the world to unite around this cause and do what I think is necessary by disarming, by denuclearizing at least?
Absolutely. It is not in the rational self-interest of any of the countries that have nuclear weapons to continue to have nuclear weapons. If we have a nuclear war, all these countries are going to be destroyed. And the experts tell us that this is what's going to happen if we keep these weapons around. Sooner or later, they're going to get used. There's this notion that by having nuclear weapons and then the other side having nuclear weapons, there's this balance of terror. It's called mutually assured destruction.
Yeah.
And that somehow or other this guarantees the weapons will never be used. Well, this is just kind of magical thinking. There's no mystical power that nuclear weapons have that guarantees they'll never be used. And as Robert McNamara, former defense secretary, pointed out, we haven't avoided a nuclear war because of deterrence, because we had sound military doctrine, because we had wise leaders, because we had infallible technology. At times, none of these have been present. We've avoided nuclear war because, quoting him, we lucked out.
Yeah.
It was luck that prevented nuclear war. And sooner or later, luck is going to run out. Now, the policy of the U.S. government and the Russian government and the Chinese government to maintain nuclear weapons forever is really nothing more than a hope for continued good luck. And that's a very crazy basis for national policy. So I'm kind of amused when we are told that we're being unrealistic when we talk about getting rid of nuclear weapons by people whose idea of national security is to keep these nuclear weapons until they blow up. I was talking to a security expert for a member of Congress a couple of weeks ago, and he said, well, it's like it's a balancing act. We're carefully balancing so we don't fall off. I said, yeah, exactly. It's like you're walking on a tightrope, and your plan is to stay on the tightrope forever until you fall off, instead of having a plan for walking to the other side and getting off of it. And he said, yeah, sort of. We do need to get off of this tightrope, and rational people are capable of making the decision to do that. We don't always have rational leaders.
I think we very, very rarely do.
But surprisingly, people who seem even quite irrational at times can make rational decisions when they're presented with the information.
Correct.
So at the in the 80s, it wasn't the United States. It was the Soviet Union that took the lead in diffusing tension. Gorbachev reached out to Reagan. I don't think he expected Reagan to be responsive, but he was. Today, I think it's up to the United States. I certainly don't see Putin providing leadership on this issue.
No.
Xi could perhaps. China is doing quite well in the world right now. They particularly should be able to understand how counterproductive it would be for them to provoke a nuclear war. And so they perhaps might take the leadership role. But we can't affect, if we in the United States can't influence events in China, we can influence events here in the United States. And what we've done is we've launched this campaign called Back from the Brink, which is a national campaign now to try to get the Biden administration or its successor to adopt a different view of nuclear weapons, to stop viewing them as something which makes us safe, which they don't, to understand instead that they are the greatest threat to our security, and to understand that it should be the highest national security priority of the United States to try to eliminate these weapons worldwide, and therefore to try to begin negotiations with the other 8 nuclear-armed states for a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement to get rid of their arsenals. We're not calling on the U.S. to disarm unilaterally. We're calling on the United States to exercise leadership in the hope of bringing about universal disarmament. And there's no guarantee this would succeed. The United States might reach out and say, we think this is what needs to happen, and invite the other countries to enter into this process and get a negative response. But there's no reason to assume that'll happen. And we do know what's going to happen if we don't get rid of the weapons. So there's absolutely no downside to trying this.
No, I would agree with you. I think I'm optimistic about it as well. I just think that I'm probably lacking for a clear direction as to which party would really take lead on it nowadays, because it almost seems, I mean, historically Republicans have been the war hawks, right? Mm-hmm. They've been the ones that have pushed wars. It almost seems like there's a role reversal these days in terms of, Trump, his domestic policy seemingly was less of war hawk than most Republicans. And now, we're indirectly involved in this military conflict during the Biden administration. And I understand that nuclearism and war are not, mutually exclusive. But you would tend to think that you'd want somebody in power that favored less of that kind of a policy, less of a hawkish policy. And I don't know if I see any of the candidates or any of the parties really displaying that. If I had hope for maybe one candidate, and it would be somebody that I'd guess you probably wouldn't be a huge fan of, it'd be Bobby Kennedy Jr., just because he's sort of an anti-establishment kind of guy, and has more of the older ideals of the Democratic Party. But I don't know. I like the vision, and I agree with it. I think that really we have no way forward unless we figure out a way to deal with this. But we should be actively involved in choosing leaders that we think are going to be involved in the fight. And
I think it's unclear exactly who's going to provide the leadership.
Absolutely.
There shouldn't be a partisan issue at all.
No.
In the 80s, the Freeze movement had Republicans and Democrats. Country is much
What's
more.
the Freeze movement?
I'm sorry. The Freeze movement was the mass political movement in the 1980s for change in nuclear policy.
Okay.
And this started in around 1980 here in Western Massachusetts, in Northampton and the hill towns.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Were you a part of that?
No, I wasn't living here until '83, but
okay.
This was a movement that said that the Cold War arms race is leading us to catastrophe, and we need to stop the arms race. It wasn't calling for the elimination of nuclear weapons, which was seen as a bridge too far at that point, but was saying that we should stop building more, we should stop trying to outdo each other, and that was the movement really that mobilized millions of people. It was vigorously attacked by the Reagan administration with the absurd argument that it would freeze the U.S. into a position of inferiority. The United States had 30,000 nuclear warheads. The Russians had 32,000 nuclear warheads. And so if we stopped building them, we were going to be frozen into a position of inferiority. It takes about 200 nuclear warheads to destroy the world. And we had 30,000 of them, but somehow this wasn't enough. You see echoes of this view still today.
We have around 3,000 now. Is that correct?
Actually, we have almost 6,000, but a couple of thousand of them are in storage and slated to be dismantled. There are about 3,500 that are in what would be considered the active arsenal, and about 1,500 of them are actually deployed.
And is that still a result of the policies that Reagan had for, ramping back on the nuclear weapons, the ones that are slated to be destroyed?
Yes, and I mean there were a number of agreements between the United States and the Soviet Union to cut their arsenals. The START Treaty cut down the number, and the New START Treaty, which was negotiated by Obama, put a cap of 1,500 deployed warheads. So that's about what both the U.S. and Russia have today. That means that they're on missiles,
ready to go,
on the basis to be loaded onto the bombers, on submarines. But we don't. It's not clear which party will provide leadership on this. At the moment, it is actually Democrats, primarily progressive Democrats, who are promoting the idea of getting rid of nuclear weapons. I certainly hope it doesn't stay like that. I think that there's no reason why Republicans and more moderate Democrats shouldn't embrace this idea as well. And I think that the idea of nuclear abolition can be separated from some of the other traditional peace issues. I mean, Biden has been quite steadfast in his support for Ukraine. But despite that, he also has been quite clear that the ultimate objective here is to avoid nuclear war. And he has, in speeches in the past, indicated an understanding of the need to get rid of nuclear weapons that is quite remarkable. It has not been reflected in the policies of his administration so far. But he clearly seems to understand what is at stake here and why we need to get rid of these weapons. So I would be quite hopeful that he could provide this leadership in the short term. And I think it is something that could happen very quickly. There's no reason in the world why Biden couldn't give a speech, next week, putting forward the vision of a world free of nuclear weapons, citing the increased understanding of the nuclear danger that we all have now because of Ukraine.
And how do you see that playing out? Because I believe you mentioned the United States taking lead on it, and Russia would need to join us. You have countries like North Korea. These countries, they would have to follow suit with that. And I mean, obviously we are bigger and more powerful, so we would have to bully them to some degree, I'm sure, because they would be reluctant to give it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key to this actually is the U.S.-China relationship.
Yeah.
I think Biden needs to sit down with Xi, and they need to have a heart-to-heart about the fact that the way they are both behaving, the U.S. and China today, is leading the world to catastrophe. Putting aside Russia just for the minute, even if the Russian situation didn't exist, the U.S. and China are on a collision course in East Asia, which could lead to a war.
Taiwan?
Taiwan.
Yeah.
But even absent Taiwan, they are spending all their time and energy competing with each other to see who's going to be the paramount power in the world. And while they're doing that, they're not devoting enough attention towards the climate crisis. And again, even if we don't have a nuclear war, if we don't attend to the climate crisis, civilization as we know it is not going to survive. I mean, we know enough about what's going to happen and how that's going to affect the world. They need to sit down and they need to come to an understanding that the whole way that great powers have always related to each other, which is to say to compete with each other to see who comes out on top, doesn't work when there's an external threat to the survival of both of them. The external threat right now isn't a third country, it's a series of existential threats to human survival. The climate crisis, the next pandemic, which will emerge with a population of 8 billion people, we will have additional pandemics, nuclear war, the depletion of resources that our economy requires, because the kind of economy we have now is using resources in a way which is not sustainable. We have to, as a civilization, global civilization, deal with these problems. And the U.S. and China have a strong national interest in figuring out how to stop competing with each other and to start cooperating. They are the two great powers in the world today. To bring Russia into the conversation, if the U.S. and China are able to come to that kind of an agreement, the next step is to sit down with Russia, which has become increasingly dependent on China and really can't afford to act independently of China, and bring them into the conversation. And then I think the rest of it falls into place. It's going to be difficult to convince North Korea. It's going to be difficult to convince Pakistan, probably to convince Israel and maybe even France that they should give up their nuclear weapons. But if the United States, Russia, and China agree that the security of the world demands the elimination of nuclear weapons, the other countries will come along. We need to figure out assurances for their national security, but that stuff can't get worked out. And it can get worked out fairly quickly if need be.
You would think the only motivation that would really be necessary would be the survival of the human race. But I'm afraid that there's some other motivation that maybe we have to get behind or convince these leaders of in order to sort of because you brought up the climate crisis, and I think that there's opportunists in either party that wherever you land on the climate issue, you can agree that politicians are taking advantage of the climate crisis and the green movement to make money, whether it's pushing EV vehicles or solar panels or wind farms or whatever the case may be. There's a financial interest that's at play, and good, bad, or indifferent, it's being used to propagate the climate, furthering the climate agenda. And that's, like I said, however you feel about it.
The principal financial interest is the enormous financial interest of the fossil fuel industry, which is the largest industry in the world, and which has known for decades that their behavior is dooming civilization and has gone ahead anyway. And I think there are two things at work here. One is an incredible short-sightedness, a focus on the bottom line this quarter, this year, without thought to what's going to happen in the future, which has led companies. I mean, it's not in Exxon's interest to destroy the world either in the long term. In the short term, they're making money off of it. The other thing, I think, is simply a question of our ability to imagine what we are doing to ourselves. We have enormous difficulty getting our arms around the fact that we're destroying the world. What the scientists tell us, I think, with an overwhelming global consensus at this point about climate change, where we are headed is a place where we cannot go and expect human civilization to survive. but we have trouble understanding that. We can't believe that all these horrible things are actually going to happen. It's the same with nuclear war. I talk about the medical consequences of nuclear war all the time, and they are far worse than any of us really think.
It'd probably be better to be incinerated by the bomb than to suffer the medical consequences of being, 30 miles out from the blast zone?
Yeah, and the consequences are that most of us will die in a nuclear war. A war between the United States and Russia, according to the most recent study, which we published last August, will kill between 5 and 6 billion people in the first 2 years because of the climate disruption and the global famine that will result. That's three-quarters of the human race. A limited nuclear war.
Can you talk about that for a second?
A limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan will kill over 2 billion people and destroy modern civilization. This is well studied, and we know what the effects will be. I talk about this all the time. I give lectures about it. I write papers about it. I know this is what's going to happen if we don't get rid of nuclear weapons. And still, at some level, I don't believe it.
Yeah.
I go about my daily business. I visit my grandchildren. I work in my garden.
Well, sure.
I go
Can't
shopping
stop
for the
living.
groceries as though the world is going to keep going. And it's not if we keep acting the way we are. And that's really, really hard. Now, in the 80s, we got it. Millions of people understood if we don't do something, there's going to be a nuclear war. And they did something. Today, we're having a lot more difficulty convincing ourselves of this reality and taking appropriate action. Describe a little bit about what happens if there's a nuclear war?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
even just say one bomb, know,
Yeah.
I mean, compared to was it Little Boy and Fat Man?
Yeah. So
It's like 30 times the size, right?
yeah, I mean, a lot of people have images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They've
Yeah.
seen pictures. These are important. They're a warning of what's going to happen if there's a nuclear war. But they do not begin to prepare us for what will happen if weapons are used today. Most weapons in the U.S. and Russian arsenal are anywhere from 6 to 50 times more powerful than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And if there's a nuclear war, it's not going to be one bomb on one city.
No.
A big city like New York is probably targeted with 15 to 20 bombs, each of which is 6 to 50 times more powerful than Hiroshima. I use a model of a single 20 megaton explosion to describe what that would look like. 20 megatons is the explosive power is greater than would actually hit New York, which would probably be about 9 or 10 megatons. The destruction from one 20 megaton bomb is actually less than the destruction you get if you have 10 or 15 smaller bombs that are spread out over the area you're trying to destroy. But the model, I think, works. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of that bomb, a fireball forms that reaches out for 2 miles in every direction. Within that area, temperatures approach those on the surface of the sun, and everything is vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself just disappears. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the winds are greater than 600 miles per hour, and the blast pressure is 25 pounds per square inch. Mechanical forces of that nature destroy anything human beings can build. I mean, underground shelters are collapsed by the overpressures. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat is still so intense that automobiles melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat is so intense that everything flammable burns. Paper, cloth, wood, plastic, gasoline, heating oil.
Humans.
It all ignites. And you get hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour coalesce into a firestorm, 32 miles across, covering 800 square miles. Within that entire area, the temperature goes to 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. All the oxygen is consumed, and every living thing dies. In the case of New York, it's 12 to 15 million people dead in a half an hour. And if this is part of a war between the United States and Russia, this kind of destruction takes place at every major city in both countries. A paper that we did in 2003 showed that if only 300 warheads in the Russian arsenal get through to the United States, 75 to 120 million people die in the first afternoon.
Wow.
In addition, the entire economic infrastructure of the country is destroyed.
Oh, yeah.
There's no electric grid. There's no internet. There's no cell phone service. There's no food distribution system. There's no public health system. There's no banking system. There's no system to deliver fuel oil or gasoline. And in the months after this initial attack, almost the entire rest of the population dies also from epidemic disease, from starvation, from radiation poisoning. But that's only what happens in the United States and Russia. A war between the United States and Russia puts 150 million tons of soot in the upper atmosphere, where it lingers for decades.
And blocks out the sun.
It blocks out the sun. It drops temperatures across the planet. And as a result of that, there is an incredible decline in food production. All the ecosystems which have developed since the last ice age collapse, the temperatures actually drop on average 18 degrees Fahrenheit across the planet. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, the temperatures drop 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I mean, that's colder than anything that we have seen since the coldest moment of the last ice age.
You're talking the next ice age, basically.
Yeah, we don't get glaciers a mile thick because it only lasts for 20 years. But during that 20 years, we all die.
Yeah.
And that's, the paper that I alluded to before that was published last summer shows that 3/4 of the human race starves to death in the first 2 years. The paper only looked at the first 2 years. The starvation undoubtedly continues because the climate disruption continues for another decade. And we have to understand this is like not the plot of a movie. This is the danger we're living with every day that we allow these weapons to continue to exist. And our leaders don't seem capable of understanding this. There's this really interesting phenomenon where when people are in power, they really are resistant to these ideas. When they retire and somebody else is the person whose finger is on the button, they get really nervous and frightened.
Yeah.
And there's this long list of former generals, former defense secretaries, former heads of government, who now that they've retired are passionate advocates for the abolition of nuclear weapons, something which they did not advocate when they were in power. We got to listen to them, and we got to convince the ones that are in power to listen to them because they're speaking the truth. I mean, Henry Kissinger, architect of our nuclear policies, George Shultz, William Perry, the former defense secretary. These people have all endorsed the idea that we need to get rid of all nuclear weapons. William Perry and George Shultz have explicitly endorsed the Back from the Brink campaign. And we need to listen to these people because they really know the truth about nuclear weapons, and they really understand what's going to happen if they get used.
What was it that sort of piqued your interest in this topic? What got you involved in the movement?
I got involved around the question of nuclear power and the health risks that it posed back in the late 1970s. I was, as a medical student, working on the Navajo reservation in Shiprock, New Mexico.
Really?
And I ran out of reading material, and the only book I could find that looked worth reading at the local bus station, which is where you bought books in Shiprock, New Mexico.
It wasn't Audible?
No, was a book called We Almost Lost Detroit, which talked about the meltdown that took place on the first day of operation of the Enrico Fermi reactor, which was the first nuclear power plant in the United States. And it was 30 miles west of Detroit, and for a month nobody knew what was going to happen. And nobody did anything to prepare the city of Detroit for the possibility of a major meltdown. Fortunately, it did not progress to a major release of radiation.
Like a Chernobyl?
Like a Chernobyl or a Fukushima. If it had, millions of people in Detroit and Toledo, Ohio would have been exposed to high levels of radiation, and they just let them sit there. So I got involved in the anti-nuclear power movement as a public health question. This struck me, this is an insane risk to expose people to. As a doctor, I should be concerned about this. And with some other doctors in the Boston area, started this organization called Physicians for Social Responsibility. And it turned out there had been a similar organization in the early 1960s that was concerned with nuclear weapons. And when we met with some of the doctors from the original group, they told us to take the name. We didn't actually have a name at that point. So we took on the name of the previous organization. And they said, you also ought to look at the articles we published in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 1962 about nuclear war. And it turns out there had been a special issue of the New England Journal of Medicine, which is the leading medical journal in the world.
You subsequently published a report in there, no?
I've had some articles in there as well. But this was an extraordinary series of articles, a special issue detailing in great detail what happens if there's a nuclear war. And along with the other people in our nuclear power group, we all read these articles and quite agreed that while nuclear power is a major problem, we continue to work for its elimination. The real issue is getting rid of nuclear weapons because they have the ability to totally destroy human civilization.
Are you still concerned about nuclear power?
Very much so.
Yeah.
I mean, and the situation around the reactor at Zaporizhzhia in Ukraine, I think underlines the dangers there.
Fair enough.
Nuclear power plants are designed to to be safe only if everything works perfectly all the time. And they're not supposed to be in the middle of war zones. Well, Ukraine wasn't supposed to be a war zone, but it is.
Fair enough. Anything could be considered a war
there,
zone
there,
in the right
there, there are
circumstances.
50 nuclear reactors in Japan and I think 24 in South Korea. There are over 100 in the United States. There are over 100 in China. All these places could be, and there are many in Russia. And it doesn't require that they be attacked and blown up. If you just cut off the electricity to these plants, they lose.
They decay.
They're all dependent on outside electricity to run their cooling systems.
Right.
And if they're not cooled, they melt down, and you have a Fukushima or a Chernobyl.
Yeah. So then you don't see it as a possible solution to the climate crisis.
No, in order to use nuclear power to replace fossil fuel, we'd have to bring a nuclear power plant online every day, and they take 20 years at this point from conception to completion, and it's not a solution. They're also phenomenally expensive. And for every dollar that we spend on nuclear power, we can get 4 or 5 times more electricity right away, not in 20 years, if we spent that money on solar or wind or conservation. So we need to really focus on true renewables and conservation and figuring out how to do things differently than we do now.
Where do you see yourself taking the organizations, because you're still a fairly active member at this point? I mean, it was 2017 you all won the second Nobel Prize, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
And are you as active as you once were? Because I remember you were co-president and president at the time.
Yeah, I was the co-president of the International Physicians from 2012 until 2021. I'm still on the board, and I'm on the steering committee of the Back from the Brink campaign here in the United States. And I stopped practicing medicine 2 years ago, so I'm working basically full-time on the nuclear weapons issue.
So you've
at this
gotten
point.
more involved in it at this point.
Yeah.
Okay. And I mean, the long-term goal is obviously to be successful in denuclearization. What action steps are you all currently taking? What's your, I guess, what's the short-term plan?
Well, the Back from the Brink campaign is organized around the idea that we need to set forward what U.S. nuclear policy ought to be. So we've done that. The U.S. needs to enter into negotiations with the other 8 nuclear weapon states and stop pretending that nuclear weapons make us safe. How do we get the U.S. government to do that? I've gone around the country reaching out to cities and towns, church groups, labor unions, professional associations, civic groups, asking them to endorse this policy platform. And at this point, we've gotten over 60 cities, including most of the major cities in the country, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Honolulu, Tucson, Salt Lake City, Minneapolis, Des Moines, to endorse this campaign.
Meanwhile, you get to travel all over the place.
Well, we try to do as much as we can by Zoom, but do some traveling.
You might need to convince Honolulu a little bit more.
We've gotten the California and Oregon state legislatures, the Maine State Senate, the Rhode Island State Senate, the New Jersey Assembly to endorse this. There's a resolution before Congress now, introduced by Congressman Jim McGovern from here in Western Massachusetts, that just today got its 32nd co-sponsor, which is very significant number in just a few months.
Yeah.
And we are in conversation with many other people in the Congress about them coming on board.
Has it been bipartisan?
It is not. And that is a focus. We're trying to find Republicans to bring on board, but it is primarily Democrats at this point. And we're keenly aware of the fact that is a weakness.
But I don't think that it'll be that difficult. I mean, it's a difficult task all in of itself, but I honestly do see the Republican Party, or at least members of the Republican Party, moving in that direction.
Well, I hope so, because as we were talking about before, this absolutely should not be a partisan issue. Preventing nuclear war and saving the world really should appeal to everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've also reached out to the faith community, and we've received endorsement nationally from the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Methodist Church, the Congregational Church, the Unitarian Universalist Church.
It would make sense that those organizations would want to be a part of something like this.
Pax Christi within the Catholic community, the Reconstructionist Jewish movement, and so on. And we are continuing to reach out to cities and towns, members of Congress, faith communities, and so on, trying to build this movement. And it's grown quite rapidly.
You have like 200,000 members worldwide. Is that correct?
International Physicians Prevention of Nuclear War does.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Back from the Brink.
Back from the Brink is an American organization, and it's really not an organization; it's a campaign. We don't have members. We've chosen to try to organize it around communities rather than individuals, although individuals are welcome to join. And the website for the campaign, preventnuclearwar.org, explains all of this in great detail. And this is where I've got most of my focus at this point, is trying to build this campaign, because I think the United States is going to play the key role, and my colleagues in the International Physicians and in the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, I think, share that assessment, and just sort of see that those of us who live in the United States, we need to focus on moving our government. And so that's really what I'm putting my energy behind. And I would invite anybody who has an interest in this to visit the website and figure out how to be in touch. And how to
Are there ways to get involved?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We've designed this campaign to try to be as friendly as possible for people to take part in. And there's all kinds of information about things you can do, about how to be in touch with the campaign, and so on. We've also organized local hubs around the country. So there's a hub here in Western Massachusetts. There's a separate hub in Boston. And you can, through the website, you can figure out how to get hooked up with the local hubs and join in the local activities.
Are you planning another, what was it, Million March? Was that on Central Park?
Yeah, we're not quite at that point yet. But yes. That's...
We should. I think that would be great.
No, what we need to do is to create the kind of understanding that made that march possible. When that march was announced early in 1982, people started chartering buses to go to New York before they knew exactly what time the march was going to be or where it was going to be. They just knew there was going to be a march in New York City. And people were so concerned about nuclear war that they just, in huge numbers, churches started just chartering buses. We're not at that point yet, which is the problem. You know, if you announced a march in New York today, some people would come. But we need to educate people. And that's really the core strategy of Back from the Brink at this point, is to use all of this activity to educate more people about the need to get rid of these weapons.
Are there younger folks involved in the cause?
Yeah, there are. I mean,
no offense, I'm not saying that you're an older folk.
The peace movement as a whole tends to be led by people who, the anti-nuclear movement, by people of my generation.
Yeah.
Because we lived through this in the Cold War, and we really knew about this stuff.
You have perspective.
We had the lived experience.
Yeah.
One of the problems that we're facing is that younger people have never been taught about this.
No, we haven't. So, I mean, we weren't forced to go under our desks at school and
exactly
heard the sirens.
You didn't, and you didn't live through the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we all thought that the world was going to end that week. When I talk to college students, they get it right away. The problem is getting college students to pay attention to this issue, and that's a major focus. And we do have some very active youth leaders. I'm going to be speaking at the end of this month at a conference of young people in Florida. I just spoke actually at a conference of young people at the UN last Friday. I'm speaking on a lot of campuses, high schools as well as colleges. And that is a key focus, is trying to increase the leadership. Some of the key staff people in this campaign are in their 20s. Which is great because they know how to use social media, which I don't.
Well, that's what I was going to say. And I think that, honestly, Doc, this generation is hungry for something to rally behind, to the point where it seems like they make up stuff to be angry about at times. Like, honestly, maybe it's just my perspective, but I feel like a lot of the social causes and the things that folks are going out and rioting in the streets over is not to belittle, you know, what these folks are fighting for, but in the scheme of things, it's fairly trivial when you're comparing it to destruction of the human race, and with the populist way that this country has gone, it seems like something we could all get behind, you know, and it might be that uniting factor that young people are looking for. There could be an anti-war movement. In a lot of ways, this generation is, I think, similar to the 60s and 70s in their activism.
There's a tremendous concern about the visible injustices in the world, and I think that's all to the good. The problem that we face in trying to mobilize people around nuclear war is that it's not visible at the moment, which is also a good thing. The climate crisis is in people's face every day.
Sure.
It dominates the news. There's one horrible weather disaster after another. There's one temperature record set every day, it seems. We're constantly being reminded of it. We need to figure out how to make the nuclear threat palpable to people so that they see it.
False flag?
No false flag. No
I'm
nuclear.
kidding, Doc.
No bomb going off someplace. I mean, that it may take that to really get people mobilized.
Well,
but our job,
it might. But
our job is to try to get people to understand
prior
this
to that
happening.
Yeah.
And when I talk to, as I said, when I talk to young people, they're tremendously concerned about this issue. They hadn't heard about it. The thought that there is another existential threat that could occur, like tomorrow, that could literally end their world tomorrow, is profoundly disturbing to them, and they want to do something about it. And fortunately, we're able to offer them a vehicle through the Back from the Brink campaign. Because if you just tell people things are bad, but don't show them a way to make them better, you haven't done anything. And
people can be lazy sometimes.
People,
and they don't know where to start.
They don't. Yeah, no one knows where to start.
Yeah.
When you're talking about preventing nuclear war, so it's important that there be a place, and fortunately, there is now. I think Back from the Brink, that was much of what we had in mind, was to create a vehicle that we could offer to people who became concerned about this issue. And one of the things that I try to emphasize to people is, it's also pretty scary when you talk about this. And people who are already worried about the climate crisis, now they get told that there's another existential threat. It all feels pretty heavy.
Because people are never going to leave their house.
And one of the things that people need to understand is that, number one, the nuclear threat is something which would be relatively easy to deal with. This is not like the climate crisis that requires retooling the whole global economy.
Right.
This is something that requires dismantling 13,000 small machines about the size of the chairs we're sitting in. We've already dismantled 50,000 of them. We know exactly how to do it. This is a very discrete, doable task. And in the process of doing it, of creating the international agreement to bring this about, we will essentially be modeling the kind of behavior that nations need to also pursue to deal with the other great existential crisis, the climate threat, to deal with the next pandemic when it emerges. And that can be an extremely inspiring way of looking at things. The other thing that I try to emphasize to people is, look, everybody wants to do something good with their life. They want their life to matter, to mean something. People living today have literally been given the opportunity to save the world. And there's nothing that a person can do with their life that is more important than that. Fair enough. Every one of us, no one of us is expected to do this all by ourselves, but each one of us does need to do that part of the job which is ours to do. And if we do that, I truly believe that we're going to be successful. And that's going to be pretty great. I mean, to be able to look in the mirror 5 or 10 years from now and say, I helped save the world, that's going to be a pretty great thing.
Well, I have a thought, just one simple idea. There doesn't seem to be a lot of really good movies coming out lately. Hollywood seems to have hit a little bit of a drought. Perhaps if we could create a really good blockbuster film about a nuclear war that could reach a lot of people, because I remember learning about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it's almost inconceivable. It's hard to imagine in your mind the amount of destruction something like that. And nuclear weapons have changed a lot since then. Mm-hmm. We no longer drop them from planes and hope the hell you get out of the blast zone. You can fire them off from the comfort of your living room. Yep. And they're much more powerful now. Yep. So it's even more difficult to imagine this. So we have a lot of visual learners now. So social media, a movie, something that really puts this in people's faces, like it really brings it to your imagination. I think it is one of the key missing pieces. And I must tell you, almost whenever I give a talk, somebody in the audience says, we need a movie like The Day After. Have you ever seen The Day After? No. This was a movie that was shown on television I think it was ABC in 1983. It was viewed by over 100 million people. Wow. Those were the days when there were just a few channels, a few network channels. And
This movie got enormous attention before it was shown. There was a huge national debate. Should we show this movie? It shows a nuclear war. It's set in Kansas City, Missouri. And
I'm sorry, it was filmed when?
it was in 1983.
Okay.
And there was, should we show this on television? Kids are going to see this. There were churches set up, support groups where people could go right after the movie because they thought this was going to be so difficult for people to watch, which it was. It had a huge impact. It really helped to bring home to a lot of people what was at stake here, what was going to happen. We desperately need a movie like that today.
Yeah.
And I have spent much time and energy trying to convince people to create such a movie. There was a wonderful screenplay written a few years ago by a fellow named Bob Harris, who is a professional screenwriter. He writes for, I think it's for CSI, about nuclear war. And it was actually written as an interactive movie that could be shown. I think there's a Netflix platform that allows for this, where at various points in the movie
You can start anywhere.
you're given an option. Does the person go outside or do they stay inside?
okay.
And the whole plot
Choose your own ending. type of
evolves from
thing.
that. Yeah. And it was a terrific screenplay, and he couldn't get a studio to produce it. He got one studio to give him a couple of meetings, and they no, we can't do this. I don't get it.
I think
They
the problem is there's no happy ending to this movie.
Well, but they make disaster movies all the time that don't have happy endings, and yeah, there isn't a happy ending. It's true, and that may be the reason. But I think it would be enormously valuable. There are a couple of movies out there besides The Day After that people can see that help to convey this. There's something called Threads, which was made, I think, in 1984, and then there's a movie called The War Game. That was a BBC documentary made in the 1960s. It's only 45 minutes long. It's black and white. It shows, this was before we knew about nuclear winter and the famines that would follow nuclear war. And it was at a time when the nuclear arsenals were much smaller. But it's very powerful, and it gives people a very emotionally connected way of looking at this problem. They're both available on the internet, The Day After and The War Game. But we need something that's a blockbuster in the theaters. Now, there is going to be a movie that's being released actually a week from Friday called Oppenheimer, which talks about the creation of the bomb. It's made by Christopher Nolan. He is the director, and it's getting a lot of publicity, and it will probably be viewed by many people. And I think it is going to have an impact, and we're actually planning to go to screenings of this movie and leaflet and give people information about the campaign.
No, it's a good idea.
But I don't think it's going to have quite the impact of something like The Day After or the kind of movie you were talking about that actually shows what happens if there's a nuclear war. And it would be a huge service to humanity if somebody in Hollywood would make such a movie.
Right, because I mean, as hopeful as I am that I'm going to post this interview and a whole gaggle of people will view it. We live in a generation or a time when it's sort of instant gratification. Kids are growing up with cell phones and iPads, and it's all got to be like right in front of them, in their face, and in color. Like high production value. It's got to be interesting to grab and hold their attention. And I think at that point, if something of that studio value was actually created, it would just be more a matter of convincing people that this is actually real life, that this could happen. Yeah. Because it seems almost too unreal to be a possibility.
I thought when I was talking with the guy who wrote the screenplay about his movie that at the end there has to be one of these sort of voiceover things at the end, or maybe just print on the screen that says it is important for you to understand, while this is a movie, this is based on the best science that there is. This is what is going to happen if these weapons are used. Yeah. And they are going to be used if we don't do something. And then, a couple of websites for organizations that are trying to stop this.
Yeah.
It would be very important. In the 80s, there were all these movies, there were books, there were concerts, there were huge mass rock concerts about nuclear, to raise money for groups that were fighting nuclear war, that were also educational events in which people would give speeches and talk about nuclear war. And we need to recreate that level of attention to this problem if we're going to survive.
Maybe by design that it's fallen out of the conversation. There's forces at play that actually don't want us to be talking about it. They'd rather it be sort of hidden in the background.
I think that's probably true. I think there also are just some basic psychological forces at work here, which is this is very difficult stuff. People don't like to think about it. And those of my generation who did think about it a lot in the 80s, when the Cold War ended, we were so relieved. There was such a palpable sense of having dodged a bullet that I think many of us, sort of promised ourselves we were never going to think about this again. And I remember I had been very active on this issue throughout the 80s. I remember in the fall of 89 when the Berlin Wall came down, going through my files about nuclear war and throwing out a whole bunch of stuff because I thought the problem was solved. I saved some stuff so I'd be able to show my kids what it was that I'd been doing for the last decade.
Remember when these things were something?
Yeah. And we really, that's the way we wanted to think about the problem. We did not want to think that this was still with us. And it's, when I speak to older people, it's a very complex thing that you see going on. I mean, it starts resonating with all of the fear that they had in the 80s and the desire not to have to go through that again. But for most people, older people, it really is, they see it as a huge wake-up call.
One more question before I let you go. With the reduction in the overall number of nuclear weapons, would you say we've gone in the right direction, or has it gone in the wrong direction because these weapons have just become more powerful and more destructive, or is there no fundamental change at all?
There's no fundamental change.
Because if there's one, there's trouble.
Yeah, because we know that as few as a couple of hundred nuclear warheads will destroy modern civilization, and we have in the world 13,000. So we still have such incredible overkill that we have not changed what happens if there's a nuclear war. It's useful to have dismantled the 50,000 or 60,000 that we have dismantled because we need to dismantle all of them. But we have not gotten to a point yet where you could say that things have qualitatively changed. If there's a nuclear war today, it will be as fatal to human civilization as if there had been a nuclear war in the 1960s or the 1980s.
And all the treaties and all the agreements in the world can't really change that as long as those weapons are still around and still able to be used.
The only way we can guarantee those weapons will not be used is to eliminate them.
Well, let's hope for all of our sake that happens. I appreciate what you've been doing because, there's really not enough attention being paid to this issue as of current, but maybe with some of your efforts and this movie that we're going to create together and make millions of dollars on in the process, we can get folks involved in it and interested in it.
And I think the key thing is for people who are watching your podcast, you have a role to play.
Right.
Everyone has a role to play, and people need to do that. And that's the only way we're going to get out of this alive is if everybody does their bit.
Play their part.
People need to sit down and figure out, okay, what groups do I belong to? Do I belong to a Rotary Club? Do I belong to a church? Do I belong to a labor union that I can get to endorse this campaign and become part of it? If every one of us does that, we're going to be okay. If people don't, we're not. And it's as simple as that.
And can you please remind us of the website that we can find out more?
It's www.preventnuclearwar.org. One word, preventnuclearwar.org. Easy to remember.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Helfand. I appreciate you coming and taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you, Ryan.